Mountain man marries obese noblewoman as a bet, but on wedding night she shocks him. The story begins in a rowdy saloon, where a hardened mountain man has dared to do the unthinkable, marry the woman everyone mocks. The crowd laughs, the cards slap, the church bell tolls, and before the night is through, vows are spoken. What was meant as a cruel joke suddenly becomes a marriage that changes everything. Because this noblewoman carries more than her pride. She holds a secret deed to land that powerful men will kill to take, and a truth about herself no one dares imagine. Gunmen ride, cabins burn, and faith is tested on the edge of the frontier. But when the wedding night arrives, she reveals a shocking truth that could turn a bet into salvation or destroy them both. Will this mocked marriage become the strongest bond of all, or the trap that cost them everything? Drop a comment below and share which part of the world you're tuning in from today. If you enjoy stories like this, don't forget to subscribe for more. The smoky haze in the Silver Dollar Saloon hung thick as storm clouds, dimming the yellow lamplight that flickered across weather-worn faces. Joseph Boone nursed his whiskey in the corner, keeping to himself as he always did. His buckskins carried the pine scent of the mountains, setting him apart from the townfolk in their store-bought clothes. The drunken laughter of the ranchers grew louder with each passing hour. Their ringleader, Ted Morton, swaggered over to Joseph's table, sloshing beer from his mug. "Hey there, mountain man. Got yourself a proposition that might interest you?" Joseph didn't look up from his drink. "Ain't interested in no propositions." "Oh, but this one's special." Ted's voice carried across the room, drawing attention. "See that fine English lady over yonder?" He gestured toward a corner table where Lady Eleanor Whitcomb sat alone, her back straight despite the jeers aimed her way. "Word is, she's lost everything. No money, no prospects, just taking up space in the boarding house." Joseph's eyes flicked briefly to Eleanor. She wore a simple dark dress, her brown hair neatly arranged despite the late hour. Though stout in build, she carried herself with quiet dignity. $500 says you won't marry her right here, right now, Ted announced, loud enough for everyone to hear. Spend a proper wedding night with her, too. The other ranchers howled with laughter. The saloon grew quiet as heads turned toward Joseph. He could feel their anticipation, their cruel amusement. His fingers tightened around his glass as anger rose in his throat. These men thought to mock not just him, but a lady who'd done nothing to deserve their scorn. 700, Joseph said quietly, his voice cutting through the silence. Cash in hand before any vows are spoken. Ted's eyes widened, then narrowed craftily. Done. He pulled a wad of bills from his vest and counted them out onto the sticky table. Boys, go fetch Judge Wilson. Let's have us a wedding. Through it all, Eleanor hadn't moved from her corner. When Ted approached her with his proposition, she listened without expression, then rose smoothly to her feet. If the gentleman is willing, I accept. Her refined English accent carried clearly, showing neither fear nor shame. The crowd parted as she made her way to where Joseph stood. Up close, he could see the intelligence in her hazel eyes, the quiet strength in how she held herself. This was no weak woman to be pitied. Judge Wilson arrived, looking rumpled and irritated at being pulled from his evening rest. But money changed hands, and he took his place before the unlikely couple. The saloon girls scattered flower petals from their hair across the floor, turning mockery into makeshift ceremony. Dearly beloved, the judge began, his words nearly drowned out by snickers and whispered jests. But then Eleanor's clear voice rose above the noise, quoting from memory, Love is patient. Love is kind. It does not envy. It does not boast. It is not proud. The familiar words of 1 Corinthians silenced the room. Her eyes met Joseph's, steady and unafraid. Joseph found himself straightening, something stirring in his chest that he hadn't felt in years. Here was a woman facing humiliation with grace and faith. His planned, mumbled responses became firm and clear as they exchanged vows. I now pronounce you man and wife, Judge Wilson declared. You may kiss the bride. Joseph hesitated, but Eleanor saved him from awkwardness by offering her cheek. He pressed a brief kiss there, surprised by the softness of her skin. The crowd's reaction was mixed, some still laughing, others quiet and thoughtful. Ted Morton looked slightly disappointed that his cruel joke hadn't produced more entertainment. As the crowd began to disperse, Eleanor touched Joseph's arm lightly. "You saved me from worse men," she said softly, for his ears alone. "Thank you." Joseph shifted uncomfortably, unable to meet her gaze. This was supposed to be a farce, a way to turn the tables on men who thought to mock him. Instead, he found himself legally bound to a woman who faced hardship with scripture on her lips and courage in her bearing. The lamplight caught the simple gold band, now adorning Eleanor's finger. Judge Wilson had supplied it, from a collection of unclaimed items in his office. It glinted like a promise, or perhaps a warning. Joseph had entered into this marriage thinking it a jest, but Eleanor's quiet dignity made it something else entirely. Musicians in the corner struck up a tune, a slow waltz that seemed out of place in the rowdy saloon. Eleanor stood beside him, neither demanding nor retreating, simply present. Around them, the usual business of the saloon resumed, cards being dealt, drinks poured, conversations flowing. Ted Morton approached, still wearing his mocking smile but looking somewhat deflated. He slapped the promised money down on the table. "Fares." "Fair, mountain man, though I reckon you earned every penny." He glanced at Eleanor, then away. Unable to meet the steady gaze she turned upon him, Joseph picked up the money and, without hesitation, handed it to Eleanor. "For your boarding house bill," he said gruffly, "and whatever else you need." A flash of surprise crossed her face, quickly replaced by gentle understanding. "Much obliged," she said, tucking the money into her pocket. The simple frontier phrase sounded strange in her cultured accent, yet somehow right. The night air had grown chill, seeping through the saloon's windows. Eleanor shivered slightly, and Joseph found himself shrugging out of his buckskin jacket. He draped it over her shoulders before he could think better of it. "I don't expect nothing from you," he said roughly. "This was just—" He broke off, unable to find words that wouldn't sound cruel. "A business arrangement," Eleanor supplied calmly. "Yet, even such arrangements can be conducted with dignity." She adjusted the jacket around her shoulders, and perhaps with time, they might become something more. Joseph studied her, this woman who quoted scripture in a saloon and faced mockery with grace. His life of solitude in the mountains suddenly seemed less certain, less clearly defined. The marriage may have begun as a dare, but Eleanor's composure had transformed it into something he didn't quite understand. The saloon's lamplight caught the gold band on his own finger now, matching the one he'd placed on Eleanor's hand. Witness signatures dried on Judge Wilson's paperwork, making it all legal and proper. What had started as a jest had become real, witnessed by a room full of people who'd come hoping for entertainment and found themselves watching something else entirely. Something that made even the hardened cases among them fall quiet and thoughtful. The snow fell in gentle flakes as Joseph and Eleanor made their way through the darkened streets of the mining town. Their boots crunched against the fresh powder, marking twin trails behind them. The tin lantern Joseph carried cast dancing shadows on the weathered wooden buildings. Eleanor walked beside him with measured steps, his buckskin jacket still draped over her shoulders. Neither spoke, but Joseph found himself matching his pace to hers, slowing his usual long stride. The boarding house stood 3 stories tall, its white paint peeling in places. A single lamp burned in the front window, left lit by Mrs. Peterson, the owner, for her late returning lodgers. Eleanor paused at the front steps, brushing snow from her skirts. "Would you care to come up for tea?" she asked, her voice soft in the winter night. "I have a small tin I brought from England. Ceylon blend." Joseph hesitated. The proper thing would be to decline, to tip his hat and leave this strange evening behind. But something in Eleanor's steady gaze made him nod. "Much obliged." She led him up creaking stairs to the 3rd floor, her key turning quietly in the lock of room 312. The space inside was small but neat. A narrow bed with a patchwork quilt, a washstand with a china basin, a small table with 2 wooden chairs. A shelf held a few books, their spines well worn. Eleanor lit the room's lamp, its warm glow pushing back the shadows. She moved with practiced efficiency, setting a kettle on the small pot-bellied stove in the corner. From a trunk beneath her bed, she withdrew a decorated tin. "Please, sit," she said, gesturing to one of the chairs. Joseph lowered himself carefully, feeling oversized in the modest room. He watched as Eleanor measured tea leaves into 2 chipped cups, her movements precise and graceful despite her size. The kettle soon whistled, and she poured the steaming water with practiced ease. "Sugar?" she offered, holding up a small jar. He shook his head, accepting the cup and saucer. The tea's fragrant steam rose between them, carrying hints of far-off places he'd never seen. Joseph waited. For tears, for bitter words about their bizarre circumstances. But Eleanor simply sipped her tea, peaceful as a winter morning. "The Lord works in mysterious ways," she said at last, her voice thoughtful. "When I left England, I never imagined finding myself married in a Colorado saloon. Yet here we are, and I cannot help but see his hand in it." Joseph shifted uncomfortably. "Ain't much for church. Going myself." "Faith isn't about buildings," Eleanor replied without judgment. "It's about trust in something larger than ourselves." She set her cup down carefully. "Which brings me to something I must share with you, as my husband in the eyes of the law." She rose and went to her trunk again, this time withdrawing a leather document case. The material was scratched, but still fine. Speaking of better days. From it, she removed a sealed envelope, the paper thick and official-looking. "This," Eleanor said, "is the deed to 600 acres of land following the Bear Creek watercourse south of town. It's all that remains of my family's holdings in Colorado, investments made years ago when the territory first opened." Joseph's hand tightened on his teacup. Bear Creek land was valuable. Good water, gentle grade, perfect for ranching or farming. Perfect for the railroad, too, which was pushing through the territory like an iron snake. "Railroad men been sniffing around that area," he said carefully. "Ranchers, too." "Yes," Eleanor's mouth set in a firm line. "I've had 3 offers this month alone. Agent Harker from the railroad was particularly insistent." She touched the deed with gentle fingers. "This land is all I have left of my family's name. More than that, it's my dignity now. I won't sell, and I won't hide." Joseph studied her face in the lamplight, seeing the steel beneath her gentle exterior. The saloon bet had seemed simple enough. Take their money, shame their mockery. But now he realized he'd stumbled into something far more complicated. Railroad men didn't take kindly to being refused, and Agent Harker had a reputation for getting his way, one way or another. "Ain't safe," he said gruffly. "Woman alone, holding valuable land. I'm not alone anymore, am I?" Eleanor met his gaze steadily. "Whatever brought you to accept that bet tonight, we're legally married now. Your name is on the register alongside mine." The weight of it settled on Joseph's shoulders like a heavy pack. He'd spent years avoiding entanglements, staying free as the wind in his beloved mountains. Now here he sat, in a boarding house room with a woman he barely knew, suddenly tied to land disputes and railroad politics. "I don't expect you to change your life," Eleanor added softly, reading his expression. "But perhaps God brought us together for a purpose larger than a cruel bet in a saloon." The clock on her small shelf struck midnight, 12 gentle chimes that seemed to echo in the quiet room. Outside, the snow continued falling, adding another layer of white to the sleeping town. Joseph stood, setting his empty cup carefully on the table. "Best be going." Eleanor rose as well, walking him to the door. She started to remove his jacket, but he shook his head. "Keep it for now. Night's cold." "Thank you." She touched his arm lightly. "For everything." He nodded stiffly, unable to find words. The stairs creaked under his boots as he descended, each step carrying him further from the warm lamplight of her room. Outside, his breath frosted in the winter air as he stood for a moment, looking up at her window where light still glowed. The snow crunched under his boots as he started walking. His pride, which had driven him to accept that foolish bet, now sat heavy in his chest. He'd meant to shame those ranchers, to turn their mockery back on them. Instead, he found himself responsible for a woman's safety and her land that powerful men wanted badly enough to kill for. The moon broke briefly through the clouds, casting silver light on the fresh snow. Joseph's tracks led away from the boarding house, toward the livery where his horse waited. But his thoughts remained in that small room, with its chipped teacups and a woman who faced an uncertain future with quiet faith. He touched the gold band on his finger, still foreign and strange. The night had begun with a drunken bet and ended with something far more serious, a deed that could mean fortune or death, and a woman who refused to bend to either fate. As he reached the livery stable, Joseph realized that his solitary life in the mountains had just become considerably more complicated. The snow continued falling, erasing his tracks, as if trying to smooth away the path that had led him to this moment. But there would be no going back now. The deed existed. Eleanor's determination was real, and his name was written in the judge's register as her lawful husband. Whatever came next, he was bound to it as surely as if he'd planned it all along. The morning sun cast long shadows across Main Street as Joseph waited outside the boarding house. His breath frosted in the bitter air while townsfolk hurried past, their curious stares burning into his back. The snow from last night had frozen solid, turning the street into a treacherous sheet of ice. Eleanor emerged wearing her warmest dress, a thick wool affair in dark blue. She carried a small carpet bag and a bundle wrapped in oilcloth. Joseph's coat from the previous night was folded neatly over her arm. "Your jacket, Mr. Boone," she said, offering it to him. "Joseph," he corrected gruffly, shrugging into the familiar leather. "Reckon we ought to use first names, being married and all." A hint of pink touched Eleanor's cheeks. "Joseph, then." They crossed the street together, their boots crunching on the frozen ground. Whispers followed them like shadows. From the mercantile's porch, Mrs. Patterson and her quilting circle watched openly, heads bent together in gossip. The smithy paused in, his work, hammer suspended mid-strike. Joseph felt Eleanor stiffen beside him but maintain her dignified pace. Her chin remained high, though her fingers twisted nervously in her skirts. He found himself walking closer, as if his bulk could shield her from the town's judgment. At the livery, his mule Jenny stood hitched to the wagon, breath steaming in the cold. The wagon bed was loaded with supplies, flour, coffee, dried beans, and other provisions he'd purchased at first light. A heavy tarp covered everything against the weather. "It's not much," he said, helping Eleanor onto the wooden seat. But Jenny's sure-footed, even on mountain trails. Eleanor settled herself, arranging her skirts. "She has kind eyes," she observed, studying the mule's long face. "How long have you had her?" "Going on 6 years now." Joseph checked the harness one final time. Found her half-starved in a failed mining camp. Previous owner left her for dead. Poor creature. Eleanor reached out slowly, letting Jenny sniff her hand. The mule's ears pricked forward with interest. Though, perhaps it was Providence. She found a better master. Joseph grunted, uncomfortable with the praise. He climbed up beside Eleanor and took the reins. With a gentle click of his tongue, Jenny started forward, her hooves striking sparks from the frozen street. They left town behind, the wagon creaking as it followed the rutted road north toward the mountains. The morning was crystal clear, every breath sharp as broken glass. To the west, the Rockies rose like a wall of stone and ice, their peaks lost in clouds. Eleanor pulled her shawl tighter, watching the landscape. "Is it very far?" she asked. "Half-day's journey, weather permitting." Joseph gestured at the mountains. "Cabins up near timberline, where the aspens give way to pine. Good trapping country." "You're a trapper, then?" I noticed the steel traps in the wagon. Joseph nodded. "Beaver, mostly, some marten and fox. Trade the pelts in town, come? Spring." "It must be solitary work." "Suits me fine." He paused, then added, Might not suit you, though. Cabin's rough, just logs and stone. No fancy fixings. Eleanor's voice was quiet but firm. I did not come west expecting luxury, Joseph. These past months in Denver taught me the difference between true comfort and mere show. Something in her tone made him glance over. The speculators who cheated you? Yes. Her hands tightened in her lap. They wore fine clothes and spoke of grand investments. Railroad bonds, they said. Guaranteed to triple my money within a year. I was foolish enough to believe them. Ain't foolish to trust people, Joseph said gruffly. Foolish ones are them that abuse trust. Eleanor looked at him with surprise, but before she could respond, the wagon hit a deep rut. They both grabbed for handholds as Jenny carefully picked her way through the icy patch. The sun climbed higher as they traveled, but the cold barely softened. Around midday, Joseph spotted a sheltered hollow beside a frozen creek. He guided Jenny off the road, the wagon bumping over exposed roots. Need to rest the mule, he explained. Hour or so. Eleanor nodded, accepting his help down from the wagon. Her boots sank into the snow as she looked around the hollow. Without a word, she began gathering fallen branches into a neat pile. Joseph raised an eyebrow. What are you doing? Making a fire, she replied matter-of-factly. We should eat something hot before continuing. She pulled a tinder box from her carpet bag. Would you fill this pot with creek ice? We can melt it for coffee. Joseph found himself obeying, watching with growing interest as Eleanor efficiently built a small fire. From her bundle came a battered pot, coffee, and a bag of dried beans she'd pre-soaked overnight. Learned to cook on a campfire in Denver, she explained, settling the pots in the coals. The boarding house kitchen was too costly to use often. Soon the hollow filled with the smell of coffee and beans. Eleanor produced 2 tin cups and plates from her bag, serving them both with practiced ease. The food was simple but hot, welcome against the winter chill. This is good, Joseph said, surprised into honesty. Eleanor's pleased smile warmed her entire face. Thank you, though I suspect anything tastes better outdoors. They finished eating and packed away the dishes. The sun was already dropping toward the mountains when they set out again, the shadows lengthening across the snow. Eleanor asked questions about the country they passed through, which peaks held the best hunting, where springs could be found in summer, how deep the snow got in January. Joseph found himself answering more fully than he'd intended, drawn out by her genuine interest. Dusk was settling when they finally reached his cabin. The rough-hewn logs rose against a backdrop of towering pines, their branches heavy with snow. Smoke still rose from the chimney. He'd banked the fire before leaving yesterday morning. Joseph helped Eleanor down from the wagon, studying her face for any sign of dismay. The cabin was small, just one room with a lean-to for storage. The window was greased paper instead of glass. The door hung slightly crooked on leather hinges. Every log and stone spoke of bachelor living, of a life stripped to essentials. Eleanor stood in the snow, taking it all in. Without speaking, Joseph opened the door, letting the last light illuminate the interior, the narrow bed against one wall, the crude table and single chair, the stone fireplace with its iron pothook. It ain't much, he said again, shame and defiance mixing in his voice. But it's dry, and the chimney draws well. Eleanor stepped inside, her skirts brushing the rough-hewn threshold. She touched a log wall, traced the careful chinking between the stones of the hearth. Finally, she turned to face him, lifting her chin with that quiet dignity he was beginning to recognize. It is more home than any gilded hall, she said softly, when shared with honesty. Joseph stood frozen in the doorway, caught between wanting to believe her words and fearing to trust them. Eleanor moved to the fireplace, already reaching for the poker to stir the banked coals to life. The familiar motions looked right somehow, as if she'd done them 1,000 times before. He felt something shift in his chest, like ice breaking up on a spring river. This woman, with her quiet strength and practical hands, had surprised him at every turn. Her presence filled the cabin's emptiness in ways he hadn't known were lacking. Shaking off the unsettling thoughts, Joseph turned to unload the wagon before full dark. There would be time enough to figure out what this strange marriage meant. For now, there was work to be done, and winter pressing close around his mountain home. Eleanor stepped into the cabin's dim interior, letting her eyes adjust to the gloom. A thin shaft of winter light filtered through the greased paper window, revealing the room's sparse furnishings. A rough-hewn table with a single chair stood near the hearth, while a narrow bed occupied one wall beneath a small loft. Bundles of dried herbs and strips of leather hung from the rafters, sharing space with Joseph's trapping gear. She set her carpetbag down and removed her shawl, studying the space with practical eyes. Dust had settled thick on every surface, and cobwebs draped the corners like tattered lace. The floor needed sweeping, the hearth wanted cleaning, and the single window barely let in light. Yet Eleanor saw possibility in the solid walls and sturdy construction. Outside, she heard Joseph unhitching Jenny and leading the mule to shelter. The sound of hooves crunching in snow mingled with the whisper of wind through pine boughs. Eleanor took a deep breath, straightened her shoulders, and got to work. First, she found a bundle of twigs tied with twine that served as a makeshift broom. Starting in the furthest corner, she began sweeping methodically, raising clouds of dust that made her sneeze. The rough floorboards slowly emerged from beneath their gray coating. The sound of an axe splitting wood carried through the walls. Eleanor paused in her sweeping, listening to the steady rhythm. Joseph was ensuring they'd have enough firewood for the night. The thought warmed her more than the struggling fire. She hummed softly as she worked, an old hymn from her childhood parish in England. Amazing Grace, how sweet the sound. The familiar melody steadied her hands as she cleaned years of grime from the window, making the paper slightly more translucent. When she opened her trunk, the scent of lavender and cedar drifted out, sachets tucked between her modest dresses. Eleanor arranged her few possessions carefully. 3 work dresses, 2 better ones for Sundays, practical undergarments, and her mother's Bible. At the bottom lay her small collection of books, Shakespeare's sonnets, Pilgrim's Progress, and a volume of English poetry. These she placed reverently on a crude shelf Joseph had mounted near the bed. The door creaked open, admitting Joseph with an armload of split logs. He paused, taking in the transformed space. The floor was swept clean, the hearth tidied, and Eleanor's few belongings added touches of civilization. A knitted shawl draped over the chair, a small mirror hung by the window. "Much obliged for the cleaning," he said gruffly, stacking the wood by the fireplace. Eleanor smiled. "It's no trouble. A clean home lifts the spirits." She moved to the hearth where a pot of venison stew simmered. "Supper's nearly ready, if you're hungry." Joseph nodded, watching as she ladled the rich broth into 2 wooden bowls. Steam rose in the cooling air, carrying the scent of sage and wild onions. Eleanor placed the bowls on the table, then folded her hands and bowed her head. "Shall we ask a blessing?" she asked quietly. Joseph shifted uncomfortably but inclined his head. It had been years since he'd heard grace said over a meal. "Lord, we thank you for this food and shelter," Eleanor prayed simply. "Bless this home and those who dwell within. Amen." They ate in companionable silence, the stew warming them against the gathering night. Through the window, they could see snow beginning to fall again, thick flakes catching the last light. When the bowls were empty, Joseph rose and took his blankets to the hearth. "You take the bed?" he said, arranging his makeshift pallet. "It ain't much, but it's better than the floor." Eleanor touched his arm lightly. "Thank you for your courtesy, Joseph. You are a kind man." He turned away, unused to praise, and busied himself banking the fire for the night. Eleanor changed behind a blanket hung for privacy, then slipped into the narrow bed. The cabin gradually grew quiet, save for the pop and crackle of burning wood. The next morning, Joseph hitched Jenny to the wagon for a supply run to town. They needed flour and other staples to see them through the winter months. The town was already buzzing with gossip when he arrived, though most fell silent at his approach. Near the general store, he heard children's voices raised in cruel mimicry. "Look at me. I'm the fat English lady. Watch me waddle." Their laughter cut through the cold air like knives. The blacksmith's deep chuckle joined in. "Reckon Boone's got himself a fine cow bride there. Hope his cabin floor can bear the weight." Joseph's fists clenched at his sides, fury rising hot in his throat. The urge to silence their mockery with his knuckles was almost overwhelming. But Eleanor's quiet dignity from the night before rose in his memory. Her simple grace over their meal, her gentle thanks for his consideration. Taking a deep breath, he forced his hands to relax. Fighting wouldn't help Eleanor. It would only give them more to gossip about. Instead, he strode into the store and bought what they needed, ignoring the whispers that followed him. The wagon seemed to crawl on the return journey, though Jenny plodded steadily through the fresh snow. Joseph's anger still simmered, but it began to fade as the cabin came into view. Smoke rose straight and true from the chimney. Speaking of warmth within, he found Eleanor seated by the window, using the weak winter light to mend one of his old trapping coats. Her neat stitches were closing a long tear in the leather, making it stronger than before. She looked up at his entrance, her face brightening with a welcome smile. "I hope you don't mind," she said, holding up the coat. "I noticed it needed repair, and I've some skill with leather work." Joseph set down his purchases, studying her handiwork. The stitches were indeed skilled, small even, and nearly invisible. The coat would bring a better price at spring trading now. "Don't mind at all," he replied. "That's fine work." Eleanor's smile deepened, showing dimples in her round cheeks. "I'm glad to be useful. A marriage should be a partnership, each helping the other as they can." Joseph felt the last of his anger drain away, replaced by something warmer. This woman, who had every right to complain about their rough circumstances, instead met each day with grace and industry. The townsfolk's cruel words seemed petty and small compared to her quiet strength. He hung his coat by the door and moved to unload the supplies. Tomorrow there would be more work. Traps to check, wood to split, game to hunt. But for now, the cabin was warm, the stew pot bubbled promisingly, and Eleanor's presence filled the space with an unexpected peace. The days grew shorter as winter tightened its grip on the mountain. Snow lay deep around the cabin, broken only by Joseph's boot prints leading to and from his trap lines. Inside, Eleanor kept the hearth burning steady, the warmth a beacon against the growing cold. Joseph would leave before dawn, checking his beaver and marten traps along the frozen streams. The work was dangerous. One slip through thin ice could mean death, but necessary for their survival. Eleanor watched him go each morning, worry creasing her brow until his return. She filled her hours with purpose. Her needle flew through leather and cloth, mending Joseph's gear and crafting warm items for trade. From their meager stores of flour, salt pork, and dried vegetables, she created filling meals that stretched their provisions. Some experiments worked better than others, but Joseph never complained, eating whatever she set before him with quiet appreciation. As evening settled early, Eleanor would light the lamp and open her mother's Bible. Her voice, clear and steady, filled the cabin with ancient words of comfort. At first, Joseph would busy himself with equipment repairs, pretending not to listen. But gradually, he found himself pausing in his work, caught by the peace in her tone and the wisdom in the verses. "Be strong and courageous," she read one night. "Do not be afraid. Do not be discouraged. For the Lord your God will be with you wherever you go." Joseph's hands stilled on the trap he was oiling. He glanced at Eleanor, her face serene in the lamplight, and felt something shift inside him, like ice beginning to thaw. The storm came without warning one bitter afternoon. Joseph was far up the creek, checking his line of traps, when the sky darkened. Snow began falling so thick he could barely see his hand before his face. The wind howled through the pines, drowning all sense of direction. Back at the cabin, Eleanor paced by the window, watching darkness gather early. The storm's fury rattled the shutters. As night fell proper, she lit both their precious lanterns and set them in the window, praying they would guide Joseph home. "Lord, keep him safe," she whispered, her hands clasped tight. "Show him the way back to shelter. Hours passed. The fire needed feeding, but Eleanor couldn't bear to leave the window. She kept vigil, alternating between prayer and straining to hear anything above the wind's moan. Finally, near midnight, a shape emerged from the swirling snow. Joseph stumbled against the door, ice crackling in his beard, his clothes stiff with frost. Eleanor rushed to help him inside. "Thank God," she breathed, helping him shed his frozen coat. His skin was pale, fingers blue with cold. "Come, sit by the fire." Joseph could barely move, his joints locked with ice. Eleanor worked quickly, wrapping him in every quilt they owned. She heated broth and held the cup to his lips, murmuring encouragement as he sipped. "That's it," she soothed. "Small drinks. Let the warmth come back gentle-like." Slowly, color returned to his face. His violent shivering eased. Eleanor kept the fire blazing, feeding it their precious wood without hesitation. Joseph's life was worth more than saved fuel. "Thought I was done for," he managed finally, voice rough. "Then I saw your lights, like angels' beacons through the storm." Eleanor touched his shoulder gently. "The Lord guided you home." Joseph didn't argue, just closed his eyes, letting exhaustion take him. Eleanor stayed beside him through the night, watching over his sleep, thanking God for his safe return. The storm raged for 2 more days before spending its fury. When calm returned, the world lay buried under fresh snow. Joseph needed to check his traps, which would likely be damaged or buried. This time, Eleanor insisted on accompanying him. "You shouldn't come," Joseph protested. "The snow's deep, the cold fierce. 2 sets of eyes are better than 1, Eleanor replied firmly, already wrapping herself in warm layers. "And I need to learn the land that's become my home." Joseph couldn't argue with her logic, though he walked slowly, breaking trail through deep drifts so she could follow more easily. Eleanor kept pace without complaint, her breath clouding in the frigid air. They had checked several traps when smoke caught their attention, thin wisps rising through bare branches. Joseph grew tense, but Eleanor's curiosity won out. They approached carefully, finding a small camp tucked against a sheltered hillside. An Arapaho family huddled there, an elder, a young couple, and 2 small children. Their horses looked thin, their supplies meager. The woman cradled a baby inside her blanket, while the man stood protectively before his family. "They're struggling," Eleanor whispered, noting their lean faces and worn clothing. "The storm must have caught them traveling." Joseph shifted uneasily. "Town folks won't like us helping Indians. There's too much bad blood." "Town folks aren't here," Eleanor said firmly, "but hungry children are. The Lord commands us to show mercy." Before Joseph could stop her, Eleanor was moving forward, her hands spread open to show she carried no weapon. She knelt in the snow, ignoring the cold seeping through her skirts, and spoke gently. "We have food to share," she said, meeting the mother's eyes. "Please, let us help." The family remained wary, but Eleanor's genuine compassion transcended language. She opened her pack, bringing out bread and dried meat. Joseph watched in amazement as she coaxed the children to eat, speaking softly, her smile warming even this frozen day. The elder woman studied Eleanor intently before nodding slowly. She spoke in her own tongue, then made a gesture of blessing over Eleanor's head. The younger woman, encouraged by her elder's acceptance, brought her baby closer, letting Eleanor coo over the infant. Joseph found himself drawn in despite his reservations. He showed the man how to find the best hunting grounds nearby, using gestures and broken words. When they left, the family's gratitude followed them, a gift more valuable than any fur. "That was dangerous," Joseph said later, though his tone held more admiration than censure. "But I reckon it was right." Eleanor squeezed his arm. "Kindness is never wrong, Joseph. Sometimes it takes more courage than fighting." Looking at her, this woman who had faced down storms and prejudice with equal grace, Joseph realized she possessed a strength greater than any he'd known. Her compassion wasn't weakness, but a power that could bridge divides and warm frozen hearts. That night, When Eleanor read from her Bible, Joseph sat closer to the lamp, listening openly for the first time. Her words filled the cabin like music, and he found himself wondering if perhaps there was more to faith than he'd believed, if it could create the kind of courage that Eleanor showed every day. The storm lingered over the mountains, painting the landscape in endless white. Trapped inside the cabin by fierce winds and deepening snow, Joseph and Eleanor settled into an unexpected rhythm together. The cramped space that had first felt awkward now grew comfortable, like a well-worn boot conforming to its wearer. Eleanor discovered Joseph's morning habits, how he liked to sit quiet with his coffee, watching dawn creep through frost-covered windows. Joseph learned Eleanor's ways too, her soft humming while she worked, the careful precision with which she folded every blanket and arranged their meager supplies. One morning, Eleanor caught Joseph grimacing at the bitter dregs in his cup. She shook her head, reaching for her precious tin of English tea. "Let me show you proper brewing," she said, her eyes twinkling. "There's an art to it, you know." Joseph watched, intrigued despite himself, as she heated water to just the right temperature. She explained each step, warming the pot first, measuring leaves carefully, timing the steep. "Too hot, and it turns bitter," she explained, pouring the amber liquid through a small strainer. "Too cool, and you lose the flavor." Joseph took a careful sip from the cup she offered. The taste was different, smooth and complex, without the harsh bite he expected. "Reckon there's more to tea than I thought." Eleanor beamed at his approval. Mother always said a proper cup of tea could solve most troubles. Later that same day, Joseph noticed Eleanor studying his snowshoes with curiosity. The rawhide webbing needed repair, and he found himself offering to teach her the technique. "These here knots have to hold tight," he explained, demonstrating with weathered hands. "One loose spot, and the whole web might fail when you need it most." Eleanor proved an apt student, her fingers quick to learn the patterns. Soon they worked together, heads bent over the task, sharing quiet conversation about the ways of winter travel. The days flowed one into another. Eleanor's reading became a comfort they both anticipated. Joseph stopped pretending to be busy during Bible time, instead settling into his chair to listen openly. Sometimes they'd discuss the verses afterward. Joseph's questions thoughtful, Eleanor's answers patient. Their evening meals grew longer, neither rushing to separate corners afterward. They'd linger by the fire, Eleanor mending or knitting while Joseph worked on his traps or tools. The silence between them grew comfortable, like a warm blanket shared against the cold. One afternoon, Joseph hauled in firewood, his boots heavy with snow. He found Eleanor standing on the covered porch, wrapped in her shawl, gazing at the mountains. The storm had finally broken, and the setting sun painted the snow-covered peaks in shades of rose and gold. He paused, struck by something in her expression, a mixture of beauty and pain that made his chest tight. She must have heard his approach, but she kept her eyes on the horizon. "My husband used to say I was an embarrassment," she said softly, her words floating like frost in the air. "The Earl would hide me away when important guests visited. Said my size brought shame to his noble house." Joseph set down his wood, moving closer but not too close, sensing she needed space to speak. He had affairs, you see. Beautiful, slender ladies who fit his idea of proper nobility. Her voice caught, but she lifted her chin. When I confronted him, he laughed. Said no real man could want me, that I should be grateful he'd married me at all. Tears threatened at the corners of her eyes, but Eleanor blinked them away, proud even in pain. Joseph felt anger rise in his throat, not the hot, familiar rage of wounded pride, but something deeper and more protective. "Men who mock others are the ones deserving shame," he said roughly. Eleanor turned to him then, her face soft in the fading light. "What about you, Joseph? What shadows haunt your quiet moments?" He looked away, studying the darkening mountains. Words he'd kept buried for years rose to his lips. "Lost my ma when I was 10, he said finally. "Fever took her quick. Pa had already gone, killed in a mining accident 2 years before." He swallowed hard. "Ended up with my uncle's family, but they had too many mouths already. Started working odd jobs at 12, trapping at 14. Been drifting since. No home? Eleanor asked, gently. Joseph shook his head. Learned quick that most folks don't want much to do with a rough mountain man. Easier to stay apart, keep moving. Their eyes met, understanding flowing between them like a warm, spring-thawing frozen ground. They recognized in each other the same wound, the pain of being judged unwanted, unworthy. That evening, Eleanor went to her trunk, pulling something from its wrapped layers. She returned to where Joseph sat by the fire, holding out a silver hairbrush that gleamed in the firelight. "It was my mother's," she explained, her voice soft with memory. "One of the few pieces I kept when I sold the family silver. The last remnant of my noble heritage." The brush was beautiful, its handle carved with delicate flowers, its bristles still straight and strong. Joseph started to push it away, but Eleanor pressed it into his hands. "We are more than what they call us," she said firmly. "More than a fat lady or a rough mountain man. We are children of God, Joseph, worthy of respect and kindness." Joseph held the brush carefully, feeling its weight, not just the silver, but the trust Eleanor placed in him by sharing this treasure. He felt humbled by her faith, both in God and in him. "Why show me this?" he asked, voice rough with emotion. "Because," Eleanor said simply, "you saw me as a person when others saw only size. You offered marriage, even as a dare, when others offered only mockery. And now," she smiled gently, "now you listen when I read, share your skills, treat me with courtesy. These things matter more than any silver brush." Joseph handed the brush back carefully, their fingers brushing. The touch sent warmth through his calloused hands. They sat in comfortable silence as darkness gathered outside, the fire casting dancing shadows on the cabin walls. Eleanor ran her fingers over the brush's carved surface. "Mother always said true nobility shows in how we treat others, not in titles or wealth. I think she would have approved of you, Joseph Boone." Joseph ducked his head, unused to praise. But Eleanor's words settled into his heart, like seeds finding good soil. That night, as snow fell soft outside their cabin, something new took root between them, understanding deeper than words, trust built on shared pain and growing respect. The first hints of spring whispered through the mountain air. Patches of mud appeared where snow had melted, and tiny green shoots pushed through the softening earth. Joseph loaded the wagon with winter's bounty, carefully scraped pelts, and Eleanor's fine needlework. The leather creaked as he secured the load, while Eleanor wrapped their trading goods in oilcloth against the morning damp. "Ready?" Joseph asked, offering his hand to help Eleanor onto the wagon seat. She nodded, settling her skirts around her. The wooden bench was hard, but Eleanor had sewn a thick cushion that made the journey more comfortable for them both. Joseph appreciated these small touches she brought to their life, practical, comforts he'd never thought to provide for himself. The wagon wheels cut through spring mud as they made their way down the mountain. Eleanor hummed softly, a habit Joseph had grown fond of during their months together. The tune was some English hymn he didn't know, but its gentle melody suited the morning. As they approached town, Joseph felt Eleanor straighten beside him. He knew what awaited them, the same sideways glances and whispered comments that had followed their strange marriage from the start. But Eleanor had insisted on making this trip, particularly since it was Sunday. "We need supplies," she had said firmly, "and I wish to attend service." Joseph hadn't argued. He'd learned that Eleanor's quiet determination could match any mountain for steadfastness. The town had grown since winter began, with new buildings rising along the muddy street. They passed the saloon where their marriage had begun, and Joseph felt Eleanor's hand brush his arm briefly, as if remembering. They stopped first at the general store, where Joseph helped Eleanor down from the wagon. Inside, the storekeeper examined their goods with careful attention. He praised Eleanor's even stitching on the deerskin gloves she'd made, offering fair trade for supplies they needed. Whispers followed them as they moved about town. Joseph caught fragments. "Mountain man's wife," and "English lady." Some voices held mockery, others curiosity. Eleanor acknowledged neither. carrying herself with the same dignity she'd shown that first night in the saloon. As the church bell began to ring, Eleanor touched Joseph's sleeve. "Will you come in with me?" Joseph hesitated. He hadn't entered a church since his mother's funeral, nearly 30 years past. But something in Eleanor's eyes made him nod. The small wooden church was filling with townspeople in their Sunday best. Heads turned as Joseph and Eleanor entered, murmurs rippling through the congregation. Eleanor kept her chin high, moving to an empty pew near the back. Joseph followed, uncomfortable in his cleaned but worn clothes. The service began with a hymn Eleanor knew by heart. Her clear voice rose with the congregation, and Joseph found himself watching her face as she sang. There was joy there, pure and unashamed, that made his chest tight with unfamiliar emotion. The preacher who stepped to the pulpit was younger than Joseph expected, well-dressed in a fine black coat. His cultured accent marked him as English, and Joseph felt Eleanor grow very still beside him. Throughout the sermon, Joseph noticed the preacher's eyes straying often to their pew. Eleanor kept her gaze forward, her hands folded carefully in her lap. When the service ended, she remained seated while others filed out. "Samuel is here," she said softly to Joseph. "I had not expected." Before she could finish, the preacher himself approached their pew. His handsome face wore a practiced smile, but his eyes held genuine surprise. "Lady Eleanor," he said, bowing slightly. "What an unexpected pleasure to find you here in Colorado." "Reverend Clark," Eleanor replied formally. "You seem far from London yourself." Joseph stood quietly, noting the way the preacher's refined manner made his own roughness more apparent. This, then, was the sort of man Eleanor had known in England. "Might we speak privately?" Samuel asked Eleanor. "For old time's sake?" Eleanor glanced at Joseph, who nodded stiffly and stepped away. But he didn't go far, positioning himself near the church door where he could still observe them. "You've changed little," Samuel was saying to Eleanor. "Still as lovely as when we parted." "We both know that's not true," Eleanor replied calmly. "I was never lovely enough for your ambitions." Samuel had the grace to look ashamed. "I was young and foolish. The chance for advancement in the church seemed more important then. I've regretted my choice many times since." "Have you?" Eleanor's voice held gentle skepticism. "Indeed," Samuel moved closer. "When I heard you'd married, and to a mountain man, of all things. Surely you deserve better than such a rough life?" Joseph's hands clenched at his sides, but Eleanor's response was swift and clear. "Better?" she asked. "Better than a man who offered marriage when others offered only mockery? Better than one who treats me with unfailing courtesy, who shares his skills and learns mine in return?" She shook her head. "Joseph's hands may be rough, Samuel, but his heart is true. I would not exchange his honest care for all the hollow promises in England." Samuel stepped back, surprise and hurt crossing his handsome features. "You cannot mean to stay in this wilderness? With him? I have chosen my path," Eleanor said firmly. "And I choose it freely, without regret. Good day, Reverend Clark." She turned away from Samuel's protests, moving to where Joseph waited. Together they walked out into the spring sunshine, Eleanor's head high and her steps sure. The wagon ride home was quiet at first. Joseph's mind churned with what he'd overheard. Eleanor's fierce defense of him, her rejection of the cultured preacher's hints. Pride, and something warmer filled his chest. Finally, as they passed the halfway point of their journey, Joseph spoke softly. "You chose rightly." Eleanor turned to him, her face softening into a smile. "I chose freely," she replied, her voice warm with certainty. The afternoon air seemed to grow warmer between them as they continued up the mountain. Spring birds called from budding branches, and the wagon wheels splashed through melting snow. Joseph found himself very aware of Eleanor beside him, her steady presence, her quiet strength, her unflagging dignity. When they reached the cabin, he helped her down from the wagon with more care than usual. Their hands lingered together a moment longer than necessary. Eleanor's eyes met his, and Joseph saw in them the same truth he'd been slowly discovering over these winter months, that sometimes the strongest bonds grow from the most unlikely beginnings. The wagon wheels creaked to a halt before their cabin as evening approached. Joseph helped Eleanor down, his hands gentle at her waist. The touch lingered, both of them aware of how natural such gestures had become. Their encounter with Reverend Samuel in town had shifted something between them, though neither spoke of it directly. Inside, Eleanor moved to light the lamps while Joseph brought in their traded goods. The cabin felt different now, warmer, lived in. Dried herbs hung from the rafters, their scent mingling with wood smoke. A scatter of fabric pieces lay near Eleanor's chair, the beginnings of a quilt she'd been piecing together. "Shall we read tonight?" Eleanor asked, settling into her chair. She reached for the worn Bible that had belonged to Joseph's mother, its leather cover softened by years of handling. Joseph nodded, adding wood to the fire. He'd avoided that Bible for decades, keeping it only out of duty to his mother's memory. But hearing scripture in Eleanor's voice had awakened something in him. Memories of childhood comfort, of faith before loss had hardened him. "After supper," he said, "I'll help you with the cooking." Eleanor smiled, surprised but pleased. "Very well, though I warn you, I'm nearly out of flour." Together they moved about the cabin's small space, their movements coordinated by months of shared living. Joseph measured coffee, while Eleanor prepared venison and potatoes. The domesticity of it all should have chafed at him, he thought. Instead, he felt an unfamiliar peace. "Here," Eleanor said, holding out the flour sack. "Would you—" The worn burlap split suddenly, sending white powder cascading over both their boots. They froze for a moment, staring at the mess. Then Eleanor's shoulders began to shake with suppressed laughter. "Oh dear," she managed, trying to contain her mirth. "I don't suppose you have a broom handy." Joseph felt his own lips, twitching. The sight of Eleanor, usually so composed, fighting back giggles while covered in flour, struck him as impossibly endearing. A chuckle escaped him, then another, until they were both laughing freely. "You look like a ghost," he said, reaching to brush flour from her cheek. "And you?" she replied, eyes sparkling. "Look rather distinguished with white in your beard." Their laughter filled the cabin, unmarred by any trace of mockery or shame. Joseph realized he couldn't remember the last time he'd laughed so freely. Eleanor's joy was infectious, her whole face alight with it. When their mirth subsided, they cleaned up together, still exchanging amused glances. The spilled flour meant simpler bread for supper, but neither minded. They ate by lamplight, sharing comfortable silence, broken by occasional conversation. "The mountain air agrees with me," Eleanor said thoughtfully, breaking a piece of bread. "I feel stronger here than I ever did in England, clearer in mind and spirit." Joseph studied her in the golden light. She did look well. Her cheeks had gained color, her movements were more sure. The woman who had stepped into his cabin months ago, bearing herself with dignity despite ridicule, had grown even stronger. "The mountains have a way of changing folk," he said, "teaching what matters." Eleanor nodded, understanding his meaning. "Indeed, I've learned to value substance over appearance, honest work over empty pleasures." She touched the quilt pieces beside her chair. "Each scrap here tells a story of our days. This from the shirt you tore helping that stranded family. This from the apron I scorched learning to cook on a wood stove." Joseph watched as she lifted each piece, describing its history. The growing quilt was their story, he realized. Not the cruel bet that had begun it, but the life they'd built since. Every stitch spoke of shared meals, quiet evenings, small kindnesses growing into something deeper. After supper, Eleanor took up his 1s. Mother's Bible, its pages familiar now from many readings. Joseph settled into his chair, no longer pretending disinterest. The lamplight caught the silver in Eleanor's hair as she read, her voice steady and clear. The words washed over him, bringing not the old pain of loss but a new sense of rightness. He found himself watching Eleanor more than listening. The way her face softened as she read, the gentle strength in her hands as they turned pages, the faith that lit her eyes from within. "Joseph?" She paused, catching his gaze. "Are you still listening?" "I'm here," he said softly. And he was, more present than he'd been in years of solitary wandering. This woman, whom he'd married on a bitter dare, had somehow become the heart of his home. Her presence brought peace to his restless spirit, her quiet faith challenging his long-held anger at God. Something warm and deep was growing in his chest, something like love, though he didn't yet have words for it. He thought of her defense of him in church, her choice of his rough honesty over Samuel's polished charm. She saw worth in him that he'd forgotten existed. "Shall I continue?" Eleanor asked, her smile gentle. Joseph nodded, settling back in his chair. Outside, spring snow melted from the eaves, dripping steadily. Inside, lamplight gilded Eleanor's face as she read on, her voice blending with the fire's crackle and the cabin's familiar creaks. He felt no need to speak the feelings stirring in his heart. For now, it was enough to sit in this peace, watching the woman who had transformed his solitary cabin into a true home. Each evening like this was a gift he'd never thought to receive: companionship without demands, understanding without words, and the slow healing of old wounds through shared faith and gentle care. Eleanor turned another page, continuing the ancient words of comfort and hope. Joseph closed his eyes, letting her voice wash over him, and gave thanks in his heart for the strange paths that had led them here. Whatever tomorrow might bring, this moment was perfect in its simple grace. Spring sunshine warmed the mountain afternoon as Joseph and Eleanor's wagon rolled toward home. They'd spent the morning in town trading furs and picking up supplies. Eleanor held a small package of seeds in her lap. She'd been planting a kitchen garden near the cabin. "The wild roses should bloom soon," she said, watching the familiar landscape pass. "I noticed buds forming last week." Joseph nodded, guiding the horses around a bend in the trail. The cabin would come into view just ahead, nestled against the pines where it had stood for years. But as they rounded the corner, both fell silent at the sight before them. Smoke. Not the usual thin stream from their chimney, but thick black clouds billowing into the spring sky. Orange flames licked through the cabin's roof. "No," Eleanor whispered. "Oh no." Joseph snapped the reins, urging the horses faster. As they drew closer, he caught glimpses of dark figures on horseback, disappearing into the trees. The sound of hoofbeats faded into the gathering dusk. He barely waited for the wagon to stop before leaping down, running toward the burning cabin. Eleanor followed as quickly as she could, her face pale with shock. "The water barrel!" she cried, already moving toward it. Joseph grabbed buckets, passing one to Eleanor. They worked frantically, throwing water on the flames, but the fire had too much of a head start. The dry wood of the cabin burned hot and fast. "The deed chest," Eleanor gasped between trips to the barrel. "Joseph, the chest!" He fought his way through the door, shielding his face from the heat. Smoke stung his eyes as he searched for the small wooden chest where Eleanor kept her land deed. The flames had already reached the corner where they'd kept it. A terrible cracking sound filled the air. Joseph barely made it outside before the roof collapsed inward, sending sparks spiraling into the darkening sky. The heat drove them back, forcing them to watch helplessly as their home burned. Eleanor clutched Joseph's arm, her body shaking with sobs. "The chest is gone," she choked out. "I checked where the corner stood. It's not there. They must have taken it before setting the fire." Joseph's jaw clenched as he watched the flames consume everything they'd built together. The quiet evenings by the fire, Eleanor's half-finished quilt, his mother's Bible, all gone. And with the deed chest stolen, they'd lost even more. "This is my fault," Eleanor wailed, her composure finally breaking. "The railroad wants that land," I heard whispers in town. "I should have sold it when they first offered." She turned to Joseph, tears streaming down her smoke-smudged face. "I've ruined you, Joseph. You had a home before me, and now..." Her words trailed off into sobs. Joseph stood rigid, barely feeling her grip on his arm. A cold rage was building inside him, familiar as an old friend. He'd known peace these past months, learned to let go of anger. But now, violence called to him again. Without a word, he strode to the wagon and pulled out his rifle. The metal felt right in his hands, promising retribution. He checked the loads methodically, his movements precise with fury. "Joseph." Eleanor's voice quavered. "What are you doing?" "What needs doing?" His voice was flat, dangerous. "Those men took everything from us. They'll pay for it." "No!" Eleanor grabbed his arm. "Please, violence won't restore what we've lost. We can rebuild, find another way." But Joseph's heart had hardened. The gentleman who'd learned to laugh at spilled flour was gone, replaced by the angry mountain man who solved problems with fists and bullets. He shrugged off Eleanor's grip. "They're probably railroad men," he growled. "Hired guns sent to drive us off. Well, they'll learn what it means to cross a mountain man." "Joseph, I beg you." Eleanor's tears fell faster. "Don't let hatred destroy what's left. We still have each other. Isn't that worth more than vengeance?" For a moment, he hesitated. The sight of her tear-stained face stirred something in his heart. But then he looked at their burning home, remembered all they'd lost, and the rage flooded back. "Stay here," he ordered. "I'll be back when it's done." "At what cost?" Eleanor cried after him. "What will be left of your soul?" But Joseph was already moving into the gathering darkness, tracking the hoofprints by the last light of day. The rifle stock felt smooth against his shoulder, its weight promising justice, or at least revenge. Behind him, Eleanor's sobs mixed with the crackling of the dying fire. He paused at the edge of the trees, checking the signs. 5 horses had ridden this way, heading toward town. In the distance, an owl called, a sound that had once meant home, but now seemed to mock their loss. The spring night was falling fast, but Joseph's rage burned hot enough to light his way. With one last look at the ruined cabin, he plunged into the forest. Eleanor's pleas echoed in his mind, but he pushed them aside. The gentle lessons of recent months fell away, replaced by older, harsher teachings. The mountain man who'd learned to love was gone, leaving only the hunter, tracking his prey with deadly purpose. Behind him, Eleanor sank to her knees in the dirt, watching his form disappear into the shadows. The cabin's embers glowed like dying stars, casting just enough light to illuminate her tears. Everything they'd built together, not just the physical home but the tender trust between them, seemed to be burning away into the night. "Please," she whispered into the darkness, "don't let vengeance take him too." But Joseph was already gone, his fury carrying him forward into the night, leaving Eleanor alone with the ashes of their dreams. The crack of burning timber punctuated her quiet sobs as the last walls of their home collapsed into ruin. Joseph followed the raiders' trail through the night, anger burning hotter than the dying embers of his cabin. The moon cast enough light to track their horses' prints in the spring mud. They led straight back to town, just as he'd suspected. Dawn was breaking when he reached the outskirts, his boots caked with dirt from miles of walking. The streets were quiet except for the creak of wagons starting their morning deliveries. Joseph checked his rifle, then headed for the saloon. Raiders always ended up there, spending their ill-gotten gains on whiskey. The Half Moon Saloon was already open, serving breakfast to miners heading to their shifts. Joseph pushed through the bat-wing doors, scanning the dim interior. 5 men huddled at a corner table, still dusty from the trail. One wore a distinctive red neckerchief he'd glimpsed in the firelight. "Mighty cold night for a ride," Joseph said, his voice carrying across the room. The men looked up, hands drifting toward their guns. "Especially with a chest that don't belong to you." The man in the red neckerchief sneered. "Don't know what you're talking about, mountain man. Best move along." "Railroad hire you?" Joseph stepped closer, ignoring the warning looks from other patrons. "Or was it the land speculators?" "Said move along." Red Neckerchief stood, showing iron on his hip. "Unless you want trouble," Joseph's fist answered, catching the man square in the jaw. The saloon erupted into chaos. Chairs scraped back as the other 4 men jumped up. Joseph grabbed Red Neckerchief's shirt, using him as a shield while trading punches with his companions. A bottle shattered against the bar. Someone swung a chair. Joseph took a hard hit to his ribs but kept fighting, driving his fist into soft flesh again and again. His world narrowed to nothing but the burning need to hurt these men who destroyed his home. "Where's the deed?" he growled, slamming Red Neckerchief against a table. "Tell me!" But before the man could answer, a cudgel caught Joseph across the back of his head. He stumbled, vision blurring. More fists found him as he tried to stay upright. Through the haze of pain, he heard the sheriff's whistle outside. The raiders scattered like wolves before a torch. Joseph grabbed for his rifle, meaning to follow, but his legs wouldn't cooperate. He slumped against the bar, tasting blood. "Joseph!" A familiar voice cut through the pounding in his head. Eleanor stood in the doorway, silhouetted by morning light. She rushed to his side, her hands gentle on his face. "Oh, what have they done to you?" "How did you?" He winced as she probed a cut above his eye. "I followed at first light." She pulled a handkerchief from her sleeve, dabbing at the blood. "I couldn't let you face this alone." The sheriff appeared behind her, taking in the wreckage of his morning. "This your doing, Boone?" Joseph tried to stand straighter. "They burned my cabin, stole my wife's property." "That so?" The sheriff's weathered face showed little sympathy. "Got proof?" "We saw them riding away," Eleanor said firmly. "The deed to my land was taken. Surely that deserves investigation. I'll look into it." The sheriff's tone suggested otherwise. "Meanwhile, clear out before I decide this brawl needs answering for." Eleanor helped Joseph toward the door, supporting more of his weight than he wanted to admit. Outside, she'd tied their wagon near the mercantile. "You need rest," she said, steering him toward the store's side entrance. "Mrs. Peterson rents rooms upstairs. I've already arranged one." "Can't rest." Joseph pulled away, swaying slightly. "Have to find them. Make them pay." "And what then?" Eleanor caught his arm. "Will blood bring back our home? Return my deed?" Her voice softened. "Please, Joseph, there are better ways than gunfire." He wanted to argue, but exhaustion dragged at him like quicksand. The fight had drained what little strength he had left after the night's tracking. Eleanor led him up the narrow stairs to a small room with a simple bed and wash basin. "Sit," she ordered, pulling a chair close. "Let me tend those cuts." Joseph submitted to her ministrations, watching as she cleaned his wounds with careful hands. The room was barely larger than their cabin's storage shed, with a single window looking out on the street below. But it was the first time since their wedding night that they'd shared such close quarters. "You should have stayed away," he muttered. "Town's not safe right now." "I'm your wife." Eleanor wrung out the cloth, pink with his blood. "Where else would I be?" The simple truth in her words made his throat tight. She'd followed him into danger without hesitation, just as she'd faced every challenge since their strange marriage began. Looking at her now, focused on her task, he saw none of the helpless noblewoman those drunks had mocked months ago. "There," she finished with the last cut. "Nothing too serious, thank the Lord." She sat back in her chair, suddenly looking uncertain, her hands twisted in her lap, and Joseph realized she was trembling slightly. "Eleanor?" He leaned forward, concerned. "What is it?" She took a deep breath. "There's something I need to tell you. Something I should have said before, perhaps." Joseph waited, watching emotions play across her face. Whatever this was, it clearly troubled her deeply. "In England," she began slowly, "after my husband died, there were rumors, whispers that I was barren. That's partly why I left, the shame of it, on top of everything else." She stood, pacing the small room. "But they were wrong. The truth is, I was ill for many years. Grief made it worse, and the medicines they gave me caused my size to increase." Her voice strengthened. "But here, in the mountains working beside you, I've grown stronger, healthier than I've been since girlhood." She turned to face him, eyes bright with unshed tears. "What I'm trying to say is, I can bear children, Joseph. I want to bear them. Your children." Joseph stared at her, the words hitting him like physical blows. Children? The possibility had never entered his mind when he'd accepted that drunken bet. He'd assumed their marriage would remain the awkward arrangement it had begun, as perhaps growing into friendship but nothing more. But now, Looking at Eleanor's face, shining with hope and fear, he saw a future he'd never dared imagine. Little ones running around their cabin when they rebuilt it. A family of his own after so many years alone. "You're certain?" His voice came out rough with emotion. Eleanor nodded. "The mountain air, the work, even your simple cooking, it's all helped heal me. I feel it in my bones." She stepped closer, taking his hand. If you want such a thing. With me." Joseph looked down at their joined hands. His were still scraped from fighting, while hers showed the marks of honest work, needle pricks, burns from the cook fire, the same calluses he'd earned living off the land. Somewhere, in these past months, she'd become more than just the woman he'd married on a dare. She'd become his partner, his comfort, his home. "I never thought." He had to clear his throat. "Never dreamed I'd have a family. After Ma died, I figured that part of life was closed to me. It doesn't have to be." Eleanor's fingers tightened on his. "We could build something real, Joseph. Something lasting." He pulled her closer, careful of his injuries. She came willingly, fitting against him as naturally as if they'd been made for each other. Perhaps he thought they had been. "First, we need our land back," he said softly. "A proper place to raise those children. We'll get it back." Eleanor's voice held iron beneath its gentleness. "Through the law, not guns. Together." Joseph nodded, too overcome to speak. The rage that had driven him through the night was fading, replaced by something warmer, more powerful. What had started as a cruel joke in a saloon had led him here, to this moment, this woman, this chance at happiness. Eleanor rested her, head against his chest, and Joseph held her, marveling at how completely his world had changed. Outside their window, the town was waking to full day, unaware that in this small room, a marriage of convenience had just become something far more precious. The mercantile's upstairs room grew stifling as spring warmth crept into town. Eleanor sat at the small desk by the window, carefully writing another letter. Her penmanship remained elegant, despite the rough paper, a remnant of her noble upbringing that Joseph found himself admiring. "That's the third letter to Denver this week," he observed, pacing the confined space. His hands itched for action, not patience. Eleanor dipped her pen again. "The territorial authorities must be made aware. If we can prove the railroad's unlawful seizure, words on paper won't stop bullets." Joseph cut in, then immediately regretted his harshness when she flinched. "I'm sorry. You want to fight." Eleanor set down her pen, turning to face him. "I understand the desire, Joseph, but violence will only give them excuse to label us criminals." He knew she was right, but the waiting gnawed at him. Each day brought fresh whispers from town. The saloon crowd that had once mocked them now spoke with darker intent. Just yesterday, he'd overheard talk of running off the fat English woman before she could ruin honest men's prospects. Eleanor seemed to read his thoughts. "They're afraid," she said softly. "Afraid because a woman dares claim what's rightfully hers. Afraid because you choose to stand with me instead of them." Joseph moved to the window, watching townspeople hurry past below. "I should be protecting you better than this." "You are protecting me." Eleanor's chair creaked as she stood. "By helping me seek justice properly, not vengeance." Before Joseph could respond, a shadow fell across their window. He reached for his rifle, but Eleanor grabbed his arm. "Wait," she whispered. "Look." Through the dusty glass, they saw two hawks, one of the Arapaho men they'd helped during winter. He made a subtle gesture toward the back of the building, then disappeared into the alley. "He wants us to meet him," Eleanor said. "We should go." Joseph hesitated. "Could be a trap. The Arapaho have no reason to harm us. They remember kindness." Together they slipped down the back stairs, emerging into the shadowed alley. Two hawks waited with his son, both men's faces grave beneath wide-brimmed hats that helped them move through town unremarked. "Friend Joseph, friend Eleanor." Two hawks spoke softly in careful English. "We bring news. Railroad man has paper you seek. Joseph's hands clenched. Harker? The agent? Two Hawks nodded. Keep an iron box, his office. My son's see-through window when cleaning stable. Eleanor stepped forward. You're certain? You saw my deed? Paper with red seal, English writing. Young Hawk confirmed. Agents show to other men. Laugh about English lady's claim. Joseph felt the familiar rage rising, but Eleanor's steady presence beside him helped him master it. Thank you, she told their allies. You risk much bringing this news. Two Hawks made a gesture of dismissal. You share food in winter. We share truth now. His dark eyes met Joseph's. But be careful. Railroad men have many guns, many friends. After their allies melted away, Eleanor turned to Joseph with determination bright in her eyes. We must confront Harker directly. That's madness, Joseph protested. He'll deny everything. Perhaps. But if we face him openly, with witnesses, he can't simply have us shot without consequence. Her chin lifted in that way he'd come to recognize, meant her mind was set. I won't skulk in shadows while he steals our future. Eleanor. Joseph ran a hand through his hair in frustration. At least let me handle it. No. She took his rough hands in her soft ones. We face this together. Tomorrow morning we'll go to his office. I'll bring my letters showing providence of the deed. You'll bring your strength, and we'll trust God to bring justice. Joseph started to argue, but stopped at the look in her eyes. This was the woman who'd faced down mockery with dignity, who'd built a home in wilderness without complaint, who'd followed him into danger without hesitation. She had earned the right to choose their path. That evening, Eleanor lit the room's single lamp and opened her Bible. Joseph sat on their narrow bed, watching as she thumbed through well-worn pages. Here, she said finally. Psalm 27. The Lord is my light and my salvation. Whom shall I fear? She looked up at him expectantly. After a moment's hesitation, Joseph slid from the bed to kneel beside her chair. Eleanor's voice grew stronger as she read. Wait on the Lord. Be of good courage, and he shall strengthen thine heart. Joseph closed his eyes, letting her words wash over him. How long had it been since he'd properly prayed? Not since his mother's death, he realized. He'd been too angry at God, too determined to rely only on himself. Shall we pray together? Eleanor asked softly. He nodded, unable to speak past the tightness in his throat. Eleanor's hand found his as she began. Lord, we come before you seeking wisdom and protection. Joseph listened to her simple, heartfelt words, feeling something shift inside him. The burning rage that had driven him since the cabin's burning began to cool, transformed by Eleanor's steady faith into something different, something stronger. When she finished, he remained kneeling, head bowed. Eleanor waited quietly beside him, her presence as comforting as a warm hearth in winter. Finally, he spoke. I've been a fool, he said roughly, thinking I had to do everything by force. No. Eleanor squeezed his hand. You've been a man protecting what he loves. But now, we need a different kind of strength. Joseph looked up at her, seeing in her face all the courage and grace that had gradually won his heart. I'm ready to try your way, he said. God's way, I reckon. Eleanor's smile was brighter than their lamp's flame. That's all I ask. They stayed kneeling together as night deepened outside their window. Joseph felt the last of his vengeful anger drain away, replaced by a steady resolve. Whatever came tomorrow, they would face it together, armed with something stronger than bullets. Faith in each other, and in divine providence. The railroad agent might have guns and money on his side, Joseph reflected, but he and Eleanor had truth. And perhaps, just perhaps, that would be enough. Eleanor rose finally, stretching her stiff knees. We should rest. Tomorrow will test us. Joseph helped her up, marveling again at how natural it felt now to touch her, to care for her. Whatever happens, he said softly, I'm glad I married you, even if it started as a fool's bet. The Lord works in mysterious ways, Eleanor replied, her eyes twinkling. Even through drunken wagers, it seems. For the first time in days, Joseph felt himself smile. They had a difficult path ahead, but they would walk it together, guided by something greater than themselves. It wasn't the future he'd imagined when he'd accepted that saloon bet, but it was better than any future he'd dared dream of alone. The courthouse in Denver stood solid and imposing, its wooden benches packed with onlookers. Morning light filtered through tall windows, casting long shadows across the polished floor. Eleanor sat straight-backed in her chair, hands folded in her lap, while Joseph's protective presence loomed beside her. His eyes never left Railroad Agent Harker and his lawyers, who huddled together at the opposite table, whispering and shuffling papers. 2 weeks of waiting had stretched their nerves thin. The journey to Denver had been long, the mule wagon creaking over rutted trails. They'd spent nights in humble way station rooms, Eleanor reading her Bible by candlelight while Joseph kept watch. Now, finally, they would know if justice could overcome greed and prejudice. The bailiff's voice rang out. "All rise for the Honorable Judge, Marcus Whitman." The judge entered, his black robe sweeping as he took his seat. His stern gaze swept the courtroom before settling on Eleanor. "Lady Eleanor Whitcomb Boone," he intoned, "you claim rightful ownership of 600 acres along Cherry Creek, land currently sought by the Denver and Rio Grande Railroad. Is that correct?" "Yes, Your Honor." Eleanor's voice carried clear and steady. "The deed was granted to my family by the territorial governor himself." Harker's lawyer shot to his feet. "Your Honor, we contend this foreign woman's claim is fraudulent. The railroad has plans for vital expansion through that valley." "I see." The judge's eyes narrowed. "And does the railroad's need automatically invalidate another's legal right?" "No, Your Honor, but—" "Then let us examine the evidence." The judge gestured. "Lady Boone, present your case." Eleanor rose with dignity, despite whispers and snickers from Harker's men. She approached the bench, carrying her father's leather portfolio. "Your Honor, I have here the original deed, properly sealed and witnessed. Also letters from the territorial governor confirming the grant." As the judge examined the documents, Joseph watched Eleanor's face. Though pale with tension, she showed no fear. The same quiet strength that had faced down mockery in their mountain town now filled the courtroom. "The paperwork appears in order," the judge declared. "But I understand there are character witnesses present?" "Yes, Your Honor." Eleanor turned to the gallery. "I call Reverend Samuel Thompson." The preacher rose, straightening his collar. Joseph tensed, remembering the man's attempt to win Eleanor back. But the Reverend's testimony rang true. "I have known Lady Eleanor since our youth in England," he stated. "She has always shown the highest moral character, though He paused, glancing at Eleanor. "Though I once failed to recognize her true worth, she has proven herself a pillar of Christian virtue in our community." Next came Two Hawks and his family, the Arapaho, who had helped expose Harker's theft. Though some in the gallery muttered at their presence, the judge listened intently as Two Hawks described Eleanor's kindness during the winter storm. "She share food when we hungry," he said simply. "Not care what others think. Good heart." More witnesses followed, the blacksmith's wife telling how Eleanor had nursed her sick child, miners speaking of her fair trading, even the saloon keeper grudgingly admitting she'd brought a spot of grace to their rough town. Throughout the testimony, Joseph watched the judge's face. The man's stern expression had softened, showing glimpses of admiration for this woman who had won respect through quiet dignity rather than force. Harker's lawyers attempted to paint Eleanor as an opportunist, a foreign noble seeking to block American progress. But their arguments rang hollow against the weight of community testimony. Finally, the judge raised his hand for silence. "I have heard enough." He fixed Harker with a stern look. "Agent Harker, evidence suggests you orchestrated the theft of Lady Boone's deed, likely ordering the burning of her cabin as well. Though those criminal charges will be addressed separately, they speak to the railroad's methods in this case." Harker's face darkened, but he dared not interrupt. "Moreover," the judge continued, I am appalled by reports of how this good woman has been treated by those who should have shown Christian charity. That she has responded with grace to mockery of her size and foreign birth speaks to her character far more than any deed. He lifted Eleanor's papers. This land grant is legitimate and binding under territorial law. The railroad's claim is denied. Lady Eleanor Whitcomb Boone is hereby confirmed as rightful owner of all 600 acres along Cherry Creek. The gavel crack echoed like thunder. For a moment, silence held. Then applause erupted from unexpected corners of the gallery. Joseph saw miners removing their hats in respect, women wiping tears, even children who had once mocked Eleanor now cheering her victory. Eleanor stood trembling, tears shining in her eyes. Joseph moved to her side, taking her hand. "You did it," he whispered. "We did it," she corrected softly, squeezing his fingers. Harker stormed from the courthouse, his lawyers trailing behind. But others crowded forward to congratulate Eleanor. The judge himself stepped down to shake her hand. "My lady," he said warmly, "you have done this territory a service by standing firm for justice. I trust you and your husband will build something worthwhile on that land." "Yes, Your Honor," Eleanor replied, her voice thick with emotion. "Something to make our children proud someday." Joseph's heart swelled at her words. Looking at her now, he saw not the woman he'd married on a cruel dare, but the partner who had taught him the strength of mercy, the power of dignity, and the courage to trust in Providence. As they left the courthouse, stepping into bright sunlight, Eleanor paused on the steps. "Joseph," she said softly, "do you remember what I told you that first night, about the land being my dignity?" He nodded, drawing her close despite the crowd. "I was wrong," she continued. "My dignity was never in the land itself, but in choosing to face life with grace rather than bitterness. The land is just a place to build our future." Joseph looked down at this remarkable woman who had transformed his life. "Then let's build something worthy of your courage," he said. Eleanor smiled through her tears, and together they descended the courthouse steps into their hard-won future. The valley lay bright, with promise, in the spring sunshine. Near the rushing waters of Cherry Creek, Joseph and Eleanor stood surveying their new beginning. The land stretched green and welcoming. Before them, 600 acres of possibility waiting to be shaped by loving hands. "Here," Eleanor said, marking a spot near a stand of aspens. "The cabin should face east, to catch the morning light." Joseph nodded, already seeing it in his mind. He'd sent word to 2 Hawks and other Arapaho families, inviting them to settle nearby. Within days, their friends arrived with tools and willing hearts, setting up camp along the creek. The valley soon rang with the sounds of honest work. Axes bit into timber as men felled trees and stripped bark. Women gathered by cooking fires, stirring hearty stews in iron pots, while sharing stories and laughter. Children darted between workers, carrying water and tools, their play mixing with the serious business of building. Joseph worked tirelessly, his powerful swings echoing across the clearing. Each log placed was a statement of permanence, each nail driven a promise of home. Eleanor moved among the workers with quiet authority, offering cool water and encouragement. At mealtimes, she served bowls of rich stew, making sure everyone ate well. Inside their temporary tent, Eleanor worked on simple curtains, measuring careful squares of fabric. She had plans for everything: gardens near the kitchen door, fruit trees on the southern slope, even a small schoolhouse where children could learn together regardless of background. "The orchards will take years to bear fruit," she told Joseph one evening as they sat by the fire. "But I want our children to know the taste of apples, fresh from the branch." Joseph's eyes softened at her words. They spent hours after sunset discussing their dreams: raspberry bushes along the fence line, beehives in the meadow, paths connecting neighbor to neighbor. Their conversations flowed easier now, filled with shared purpose and deepening love. As the cabin walls rose steadily higher, Eleanor felt another kind of growth stirring within. She kept her joyful secret close, waiting for the right moment. One bright morning, as Joseph checked the fit of a doorframe, She approached him with shining eyes. "My love," she said softly, taking his rough hand in hers. "God has blessed us twice over. Not just with this land, but—" She placed his palm against her middle, smiling through happy tears. "We're going to have a child." Joseph stood frozen for a moment, his tools slipping forgotten from his grasp. Then, with a cry of pure joy, he swept Eleanor into his arms, lifting her high. Her surprised laughter rang out across the valley, drawing smiles from their friends nearby. He held her close, his voice thick with emotion. "A baby? Truly?" Eleanor nodded against his shoulder, and Joseph's laugh echoed again, full of wonder and gratitude. They stood embracing in the morning light, their joy spilling out across the land they would now shape not just for themselves but for their child, the first fruit of their unexpected love. By midsummer, the valley had transformed into a testament of what faith and hard work could accomplish. The new cabin stood proud against the mountain backdrop, its fresh-cut timber weathering to a rich honey gold. Smoke curled lazily from the stone chimney, carrying the sweet scent of pine into the evening air. Inside, Eleanor had created a home that merged both their worlds. Her delicate English tea set shared space with Joseph's worn traplines. Her books of poetry rested beside his woodworking tools. Handmade quilts brightened the walls, and dried herbs hung from the rafters, filling the air with earthy fragrance. The water-powered mill they'd built near the creek brought steady traffic from both settlers and native traders. Joseph had learned to welcome the company, his once solitary nature softening under Eleanor's influence. Their Arapaho neighbors, led by 2 Hawks and his family, had built several lodges along the creek's gentle curve, creating a community that bridged 2 worlds. This evening, as the sun began its slow descent behind the mountains, Eleanor sat in her favorite rocking chair on the wide porch. Her hands rested on her swollen belly, where their child grew strong and active. Joseph settled beside her, his own chair creaking softly as he eased his weight onto it. From the nearby Arapaho camp, voices rose in song, ancient melodies that spoke of earth and sky, of seasons turning and life renewing. The sound drifted across the cooling air, mingling with the gentle rush of the creek and the evening call of meadowlarks. "Who would have thought?" Eleanor mused, her voice soft with wonder. "That mockery could lead to such blessing?" She reached for Joseph's hand, her fingers intertwining with his. Joseph squeezed her hand gently, watching the sunset gild the river with strips of molten gold. The water sparkled like precious metal, reminding him of something far more valuable than any mining claim, the treasure he'd found in this unexpected marriage. "I've been thinking on that night in the saloon," he said slowly, choosing his words with care, "about how I acted out of pride, accepting their cruel bet." He turned to look at Eleanor, his eyes full of tenderness. "The joke was on me, Eleanor. I married you for a dare, but God meant it for salvation." Eleanor's eyes welled with tears, but her smile was radiant. "He makes all things beautiful in his time," she whispered, leaning against Joseph's shoulder. From the distant town church, evening bells began to toll, their mellow tones carrying across the valley. The sound no longer brought shame or bitter memories, but rather a sweet reminder of how far they'd come. The same town that had once echoed with cruel laughter now sent its children to trade at their mill, its women to learn Eleanor's recipes, its men to seek Joseph's counsel on hunting and trapping. The valley stretched before them, lush with summer growth. Gardens flourished where once there had been only rocky soil. The apple saplings Eleanor had planted stood straight and strong, promising future harvests. Even the wild roses she'd transplanted from the mountainside had taken root along the porch, their pink blooms nodding in the evening breeze. 2 Hawks' youngest daughter came running up the path, carrying a basket covered with a cloth. "Lady Eleanor," she called out, using the title not in mockery but with genuine respect. "Mother sent these for you, the first berries of summer." Eleanor accepted the gift with gracious thanks, speaking a few careful words in Arapaho that made the girl beam with pleasure. As she skipped away, Joseph marveled at how naturally Eleanor had created these bridges between cultures, how her generous heart had drawn people together across old boundaries of mistrust. The sunset painted the clouds in shades of rose and gold, as if nature itself celebrated their happiness. Eleanor shifted in her chair, one hand pressed to her side as their baby kicked strongly. Joseph reached over to feel the movement, his weathered face softening with wonder. "You've given me everything I never knew I wanted," he murmured. "A home, a family, purpose." "And you," Eleanor replied, "gave me the courage to stand tall when others would have me shrink away. We've built something beautiful here, Joseph. Something that will outlast all the cruel words and bitter judgments." They sat together in comfortable silence as evening deepened around them. The valley that had once known only the sharp edges of mockery now cradled their love like a precious thing, promising a future rich with mercy's triumph. Their story had begun with a dare born of cruelty, but God had transformed it into a testament of grace, proving that the greatest victories often come disguised as life's harshest jokes. Thanks for tuning in. These stories remind us that life is more than headlines, it's about heartlines. Subscribe if you want more moments that make you pause, feel, and reflect.